I'm very happy that we have Sabina Sabolovic and Natasha Ilic here from the curatorial collective What, How, and For Whom. I realized that actually in English, WHW doesn't quite roll off the tongue as nice. German.
We don't use it. We say Wegaway, yes.
Yes, I was thinking about that today. Yeah. Anyways. Yes, so they have taken time out of their very busy lives to talk to us today about their many years of working together and how their collective practice is related to and influences the topics that they address in their curatorial work. And so before I turn the stage over to them, we'll give a little bit of background information about what, how, and for whom. The curatorial collective was formed in 1999 and is based in Zagreb, Vienna, and Berlin. Its members are Yvette Kurlin, Anna Devic, Natasha Ilic, and Sabina Sabolovic, as well as the designer and publicist Dejan Krijic. Since 2003, the collective has been running the program of Gallery Nova, a city-owned gallery in Zagreb. In 2018, they launched an international study program for emerging artists called VHV Academia, which is based in Zagreb. And since 2019, part of the collective, Yvette Kurlen, Natasha Ilic, and Sabina Sabolovic are working as the artistic directors of Kunsthalle Wien in Vienna. Since their first exhibition in 2000, the collective has curated numerous international projects, including the 11th Istanbul Biennial and the Croatian Pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennial, and many others that I will leave them to talk about. So welcome again, Natasha and Sabina.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks. Yes, it's great to have you here. So I'm wondering if you could just maybe start with talking about how you started working together back in 1999 in Zagreb, and then how your practice has evolved over the years to where it is today as the directors of the Kunsthalle in
Wien. Yeah, yes, thank you, and nice to be here. So as you said, we started working in the late 90s and coming from the context of post-war Croatia after the breakup of Yugoslavia. And maybe it's important to say that nationalism was what we stood against. Because in the 90s in Croatia, nationalism has grave impact on lives of many, of minorities of all kinds. And they were always framed as a national enemy, as something that endangers the nation, whether they were ethnic minorities or any other kind. Also, dissent was framed as a threat to national body. Communism and socialist past, and even the history of labor and workers' movement, they were seen as something imported, let's say from Russia mostly, but when convenient, also from decadent West. And as such also foreign to national body politics. And nationalism and its practice and consequences was also something that was regularly swept under the carpet. And our curatorial practice often worked against it. In a way, anti-nationalist position was one of the threads that ran through all our projects. And on the other hand, the war in Yugoslavia was framed in a hegemonic discourse as an eruption of some kind of eternal ethnic hatred, very much in essentialist and basically racist terms. And we always argued that causes of the war were tied to economy and to position of Yugoslav elites that took national project as an engine for social and political organization along the lines of neoliberal, the transformation of society towards neoliberal capitalism and parliamentary democracy, which was seen as its natural companion. And of course, nationalism was its necessary flip side, so not just the side effect, but really its intrinsic part. This is probably also why we are today increasingly seeing across what used to be called Eastern Europe the rise of nationalism and populism, experiments with illiberal democracy, etc. And from this perspective, it is fair to say that if Yugoslavia was a kind of blatant example of nationalism galore in the 90s, This certainly had nothing to do with nature or its people, but probably with the nature of its socialism. And here I just want to mention some of its achievement, like non-alignment, non-block position, self-management, etc. And exactly the nature of socialism, historically, but also as a perspective for the future, this is exactly what is suppressed in the discussions on the nationalism in former Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, Croatia included. And this understanding was and still is a position against the hegemonic politics, and it really shaped our collective curatorial work. We got together, our very first project around which we got together was called What, How, and For Whom, dedicated to 152nd anniversary of the Communist Manifesto. And it took place in 2000 in Zagreb. What, how, and for whom are the three basic questions of every economic organization. They also concern planning, conceptualization, realization of exhibitions, as well as, of course, production, distribution of artworks, and artist positions at the labor market. And these three questions, what, how, and for whom, they became a motto of our work, and we took them also as the title of our collective. And today, 20 years later, this question, we always try to ask them anew in different contexts in which we are working, but they still really inform our work. So this very first project was completely came out of the context of post-war atmosphere in Croatia with nationalism, xenophobia, amnesia of socialist past, very strong anti-communist feelings. And those things were also very much played out and reflected in the cultural field. We did exhibition, that exhibition is really important because it kind of set the structure and methods of our work. So I will mention just a few things, like we tried to connect at that time recent production of artists who emerged on the art scene in the 90s with artists from 80s and 70s, because the whole project of national consolidation started from a fact as if history started anew. So for us, it was very important to rebuild historical links between generations of artists and generations of thinkers. And also it was very important to build the international context for this. This project also was a collaboration with other initiatives. It started on the impetus by ARGZIN, which was anti-war campaign zine, which in '98 republished Communist Manifesto on its 150th anniversary with a preface by Slavoj Žižek, and not the republishing of the book went by completely unnoticed. And the idea to do an exhibition was actually an attempt to try to raise visibility around the questions. Then we worked also with the very official partner. This was Croatian Association of Artists, and with the then young initiative Multimedia Institute Me Too, which at that time opened its space, and they worked around questions of copyleft and intellectual rights and activism around that. For us, it was important this collaborative method was very important, and actually all of the methods we established with this first exhibition, like a collective way of working, partnerships, reopenings and questionings of topics that are suppressed, establishing of transgenerational and international links, and finding common threads between different political contexts. These are principles that run through our projects. This we also try to incorporate in the programs of Gallery Nova, which is a small city-owned exhibition space in Zagreb that we are running collectively since 2003 in a very precarious conditions, basically since 2008, characterized exclusively by austerity and cuts. And we worked without proper contract there, but it's still kind of headquarters for our practice and the questions that we raise there, we very often extend and develop in other contexts, always taking kind of local politics as a starting point and translating it into international contexts. So this political context out of which we started, it of course changed a lot over the years. For example, for a few years in 2000, we worked very much around the notion of normalization through several projects. A normalization which we criticized within so-called transition, and also for its suppression of the consequences of the war and of the breakup of Yugoslavia, destruction of monuments, revision of history, violent and criminal privatization, appropriation of commons. But these topics, which we always rooted in the local context of Zagreb, we really use them as a symptom that's translatable in other localities. For example, in exhibition we did in 2014 called Really Useful Knowledge, which we did in Reina Sofia, and which dealt around with the questions of critical pedagogy as a kind of crucial element of political struggles, or the project that we did over a couple of years called 10,000 Vials and 100,000 Tricks, which was based on Fanon and dealt with the context of questions of political uprisings and organization in the wake of so-called Arab Springs. This was also a position that we took for 11th Istanbul Biennial, which was called What Keeps Mankind Alive, after the song from the Three-Penny Opera by Brecht and Hauptmann and Kurt Weill, written in 1928. And we did this Istanbul Biennale in 2009, which was the year, which we know now, in which the two most Googled words were socialism and capitalism. And we used Brecht as a kind of, to pose the question of communism as a political perspective and horizon and way of approaching the world. And of course, Brecht as a way out of impasse of double-bind discourses of global neoliberalism and local ethno-nationalism. And we started from very concrete constellation of Istanbul, artistic, political, and activist scenes. In a way, we took Istanbul as a center of the world and looked into similar ghost geographies of European modernism, like Balkans or Middle East or Central Asia. And we look at how to escape the games of representations entailed in those terms. So maybe in short, in terms of our collective curatorial practice, the glue that kept us together over the years is this shared political platform, but also belief in the potential of the exhibition as cultural form and political forum, also agitational position and unquestionable partisanship of curating that also always reveals its own its own complicity, and questions dialectical tensions between political trust of the exhibition and the conventions, institutional conventions with which it always negotiates one way or the other. So maybe Sabina, you pick up here.
Yeah, I can add a little also. I'll try to make it short so we can have as much as possible time for conversation. I think that maybe it's also important a little bit to just kind of, in more practical terms, talk about the conditions, working conditions in which we were for these 20 years as a collective. And something which is not easy to retell in kind of a straightforward history is a question of perception, which of course very much influences how, I mean, like simply, what jobs do you have and how do you maintain, how do you sustain, and so on. And there was a little bit of this, you know, always kind of double image that on one hand, when we started running Gallery Nova, suddenly there was also this perception that we are also like an institution. So that there was like, you know, a sense that there is a certain, I mean, for us, it always felt almost fake institutionality, because as Natasha said, we were working in such precarious condition that this idea that we do have kind of, you know, an institutional structure felt so fragile that in a way it didn't really it didn't really provide a platform which could also really sustain the collective. So it could only be, as Natasha said, kind of a headquarters, something which is a base from which we should go on in a way. And then there was this whole other life where in a way we were freelance collective. And I mean, I'm certain that anyone who's worked freelance know how difficult it is. And then if you add the collective moment to it, you can also imagine in which way things get even much more complicated in terms of, you know, like negotiating your, workers' rights, your fees, conditions of your travel, how long do you stay to set up the exhibition? Do you eat for 4 and work for 1, or you eat for 4 and work for 4? Do you then cover more ground? There is a load of these, you know, kind of questions for which the system in a way doesn't have automatic answers. I mean, it's already complicated enough that the valid, I don't know, like guest curator contract is not valid for us, but it needs to be, you know, like rethought and looked again and so on. So this was also, of course, something which was very much also, you know, shaping the possibilities of what we could do, and also how much, I would say, initiative we had to take always to somehow keep this level of self-organization, the level of always initiating projects ourselves, in a way, always somehow finding ways to strengthen this bit of a base which we could somehow control ourselves. Because otherwise, without it, it would have been really, really difficult. Of course, somehow, maybe one of the bigger changes in terms of Zagreb infrastructure was finally kind of pushed by politics. In 2006, Croatia got a really harsh right-wing government, and the Ministry of Culture was really given to an openly kind of pro-Nazi sympathizer, who totally took culture as kind of a tool to, in a way, reclaim the position of culture as exclusively national representation. And he really harshly attacked a very vivid, a very strong scene in Zagreb that we were part of in terms of a lot of out of the institutional initiatives, artist-run organizations from different media and so on. And also something which was very much, you know, how would I say, an attack to our position and a position of this fellow-minded circle of people, is that from this position, since it is a national representation, Croatia starts in 1991 and everything before it was deleted. So somehow, you know, he was openly saying, I don't hear about these histories. We don't hear about this, you know, experimentation, artist practices, nothing. We are taking this kind of, you know, year zero in a way. And this is again where we did a quite long-term project. It lasted almost a year and a half, which was done in partnership with Contact Collection, which is a Vienna-based collection, which is funded by Erste Foundation, and which has been for 30 years collecting, as they call it, another ghost geography, Eastern and Central Europe, including Austria. But it was a really rich collection where we had a super good dialogue with them when we proposed that we think it would be really important in that moment do a project which is not happening only in Gallery Nova, but in a way is supporting a lot of spaces of our size and, let's say, of our positioning and interest. And we did a huge series of about 15 exhibitions, conferences, lectures, screenings, and so on, which were in fact insisting on a dialogue of all this history that was at that moment, you know, kind of being actively attacked and dismissed, with the present and with the contemporary positions and contemporary artist voices. And also in that way, it was important in a way to kind of share a resource also in terms of the collection as a tool for knowledge, because in a way, something that was really horrible to see was that in Zagreb, there is a strong scene, which was really kind of, you know, building and growing and claiming its position, working a lot also around cultural policies. And something which took like 20 years to build, it's so easy to dismantle it. If the position of power decides, you know, to go kind of really strongly and harshly, so many of the funding bodies, so many of the, you know, kind of like opportunities to maintain all of these practices, also artistic practices, were really kind of harshly shaken. And out of that project, which was very nicely called, I just want to mention that it was also dedicated to Mladen Stilinovic, the artist who was just passed away that year. It was called by one of his works, My Sweet Little Lamb. Everything you see could also be seen otherwise. So, and out of that project, we decided to start VHV Academia. I mean, academia is here also to be kind of a provocative word to be offered, especially in our local context, which is a study program for international artists. It started 2 years ago, and for now, 2 generations of artists have been with us in an intensive program of really collective learning with different type of encounters, which always try to reach out, starting from art, but really working also with the political and social context. And it was somehow a really important move from us to also accept running a gallery program and everything connected with it, to also really start an educational platform, because in that period, we also really understood how, in a way, it's the artistic practice, artistic voice, the position of the artist, the one that we somehow need to support the most, because in a way, also everything we do doesn't exist without it. And in the landscape we were surrounded with, really sounded very, very difficult for people. We targeted people who kind of finished official education and who then really kind of needed support for this first period out of getting of the kind of protected school system. But in a way, again, as I said, it was kind of self-made project. Again, it was a continuation of the collaboration with Content Collection. So we did have some funding and some stability there. But otherwise, it was also a moment where it became quite clear that, you know, it's kind of impossible. Also in the moment, I mean, this is maybe a little bit blunt, but I think it's also important to say these things, that when you are working as a, you know, 4-women collective for 20 years, from Eastern Europe that is not interesting to anyone anymore, and you are also middle-aged and have done a lot of things, so everybody thinks they know what you are doing. It's not so easy to balance constantly getting international jobs that we needed in order, you know, to just simply maintain a living. So this is when we decided to also apply for first time this kind of, I would say, step in our institutional position. So we applied for the position of artistic directors of Kunsthochschule Wien. I mean, the reason we even thought of applying is because they did have a sentence which said collectives can apply. We applied with doubts, to be honest, because we thought, okay, they really need to be kind of culturally progressive in order to make this work, because except few couples, there are not so many examples that really kind of institutional resources are given to the collective. But as you heard from the bio, it did go well, and we were really happy that kind of Viennese cultural politics did manage even to go through kind of, you know, the legal doubts and issues and contracts and everything, and really employ 3 of us. And of course, it's now a whole new challenge, and I'm certain you've been talking through the seminar about it a lot. Also, you know, a new challenge for us, but also a new challenge for everyone in the art world, where in a way for us, it's also really important to try to build institutional work in Kunsthalle, where in a way also it does become as a new headquarter for our thinking. So just as we were working in Zagreb and then kind of translating things, for us, it's important to find a way to do a program which is also really linked to Vienna, which is happening there, opening up topics, opening up dialogues with the artists, with the whole kind of, you know, circle of cultural workers in Vienna, and see also, especially in these times where kind of the notion that this is a fully funded by the city, so fully publicly funded institution, we think in these times it's more important than ever also to look for ways how we can share this still relatively stable infrastructure. Of course, not the easiest thing where, you know, we did our first exhibition, maybe we can talk about it a bit later, which of course had to be closed after a few days, but now somehow slowly in changed circumstances, we are kind of looking for ways how to develop this new chapter and also still balance it with VHV Academia and Galeria Nova and our work as a whole, as a 4 people's collective, which goes on. So maybe that's enough as a start, and we are looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much for this. I think really to hear you talking really shows in so many ways how your constant practice in the last 20 years relates to many questions we had in this symposium concerning the question of what system actually, because of course, coming also historically from a time where it seemed possible to discuss the system question, even though it was dismantled and dismantled more and more, you took a stance all the time and did what you somehow call exhibitions as cultural form and political form. So now I have some questions. One of them is related to a bit of also the topic of the day. You talked about the importance of the role of history and exhibitions within, let's say, one could say geopolitics. You talked about ghost geographies. And indeed, the history of exhibitions, as we know now more and more, even in the canon, is very related to the countries of non-alignment. We know that exhibitions had a huge role in the non-alignment movement, and we know that they have been something, we don't know exactly what, but they have been a very important, maybe political forum, maybe cultural form within this movement. So maybe, I don't know, but maybe some ghosts of this history also sediment in your practice. And in this sense, I thought my first question to you would relate the name of your collective, What, How, and For Whom, and the name of our conference, What System actually, and really look at the what, which is often forgotten. We much more often talk actually about the how and about the for whom. It's much more important for capitalism. We forgot a bit about the what. So yeah, my question is, what can exhibitions do if you think about yourself having exhibitions as the main context in which you operate as intellectuals and politically? So what can exhibitions do? Yeah, you want to answer? Is this question understandable?
Yes, no, it's a complex question, and we don't have straightforward answer, but there is certain belief and certain hope and some experiences that make us believe that actually they do things. I mean, exhibitions are social spaces. This is also really always very important for us to treat them not as a display, but really place where people do get physically together, which is something that's, of course, now under Corona regime, rather challenged. But we really start, I mean, sometimes they instigate debate that's maybe doesn't seem necessarily as a lot. But to go back to this first exhibition of Communist Manifesto, Communist Manifesto was like a dirty word. This was absolutely not in a public discourse. And we made exhibition with 50-something artists from all around Europe, which was also not seen in Zagreb at the time. And we were the first news, we were in the news of the prime news. And you could see the person holding the book of Communist Manifesto in hands. And this was an important thing that made unspeakable speakable. There was then even debates among intellectuals, also on the left, what's the meaning of Communist Manifesto? I mean, this was before Badiou and communism and questions of communism being put back on a table. This we were so glad and so surprised that exhibition is a tool for this. That's why we were so enthusiastic about staying together and took these questions as a title of the collective. Sometimes exhibitions also destroy things, and this is both for, this is sometimes really bad, but then maybe with some, in retrospect, is not necessarily only bad. I mean, our Istanbul Biennial really also had both positive and negative impact on the local art scene. This was a moment in which contemporary art was still going kind of hand in hand with the activist and leftist political movements. After Istanbul Biennial, and this is not what we intended, but the questions that exhibition raised and the way it was enacted in a way led to certain divorce of activism from contemporary art, and contemporary art started to be again perceived really as a kind of neo-colonial Western impact, both from very left, but also from a nationalist left, and of course from cultural conservatives. So exhibitions do have impact. Something that is also very important for us is bringing artists whenever possible together. For example, we did in 2005, we did an exhibition in Kassel in Friedrichianum, which was called Collective Creativity. And it looked at artistic collectives. And first of all, to Latin America and former Eastern Europe. We think that some of the collaborations that started there by really physically bringing people together, which sometimes institutions can afford, was very important impact. Also now for the exhibition that we opened in Vienna called On Bread, Wine, Cars, Security and Peace. Wow. Thank you for, yes. It was, we also really tried to bring people together, artists together, to open certain, we don't want to call it networks, but just channels and lines of communication and political alliances.
And maybe just a tiny addition to that, I think it's really important, everything that Natasha said, which is very much about structure and collectivity, and also exhibitions as kind of a tool of political intervention, I would say very often. But I think that's something which also has been very important for us from the very beginning. And this is something we try to also kind of include in the exhibition experience, is also this very poetic, you know, kind of yes. sensual, emotional encounter with art. So we also think that on the individual level, this is something which is so important also, you know, to kind of always has as a part of exhibition as power, because I think it is a very powerful thing that also opens so many things.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and the exhibition is beautiful in Vienna, really.
Thank you.
No, I mean, this, what we were saying, this was the answer to your question, what exhibitions do. I mean, what art does, we really don't wanna, it's increasingly important for us to also let art do its things. And when it aligns with us, great. When it doesn't, also really okay. Yeah.
I have a second one, and then we open, I guess, the public might have many, and Angela might have many other questions too. It's maybe a bit tricky because you talked a lot about working conditions, and now you became directors yourself. So I can imagine being a director is a complicated task. Still, I want to hear you talking about it. Did you change the working conditions of the people in Kunsthalle? And do you see any contradictions between an understanding of self-management and the need of being a director as a collective?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it opened up a lot of questions for us. I mean, it's been a year that we are in Vienna. Of course, part of this year has kind of been in this very specific, distant circumstances from each other. I mean, you know, we retell this as an anecdote, but in fact, it is an important thing that for the first time we are working in an institution which has a workers' union, you know. And it's very interesting in a way how these are things that, you know, kind of you theoretically think of and you know, you discuss them and so on. But it's also really interesting how, in a way, you know, you find yourself in a position that also you are someone with whom the union, you know, kind of negotiates and discusses and so on. It's a very, very new position for us. And also something that, you know, we were always in a position of kind of coming from the outside temporarily to an institution and always in a way pushing certain, you know, rules and ways of the institution and looking for ways how we can, you know, question them, stretch them and so on. And now it's a really kind of, you know, a reverse situation where on one hand you feel like you have a lot of power and, you know, kind of partly formally you do, but also on the other hand, you also understand how still, no matter that you are in this position of artistic director, there is still millions of limitations, institutional ways. Also, Vienna has a specific kind of history that the artistic director and the financial director, they are equal. So this means that you really have to negotiate in a way. You don't have this position that, you know, art and content and everything is kind of a little bit more in the, you know, in the position of hierarchies, but it's really a process of kind of constant negotiations within both certain institutional histories and ways and regulations and so on, and also a certain balance. How do you introduce changes which also a wider you know, team feels okay with? How do you include them in the processes of discussing that and so on? We were glad that when we came, we realized that it's really very solid and decent working conditions, you know, for people in Kunsthalle. But of course, there are things that we would like to open up as a space where we would be interested to see if there can be less departmentalization, more collaboration, more talking to each other, more joint decision making, and so on. So these are all things, of course, that take time, and they are a big challenge for us. And
I
also,
myself asking about the guides, because I worked for 10 years in the educational department of Kunsthalle. At that time, classically, like in most institutions in Vienna, we had outsourced guards.
yes.
So absolutely no super good conditions for the people working there, and also thinking about who actually has a migrant background in the institution and who hasn't. Clearly, it is clearly biased. People, so the position for, you know, bio-Austrians are much better than the positions of...
Absolutely.
And second, of course, also the contracts for the educators have been at that time, I mean, we were fighting for it. This was 20 years ago, but it was always 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So how is it in relation to that before we agree that everything is so good there?
No, I don't think that Sabina also said that everything is so good there. Everything what you said, Nora, is true. What changed in the meantime, if I understood in your time, education was outsourced. It's not anymore. We actually have really good functioning educational department, yes, by Austrians, I would say. And this is absolutely, now the diversity of institution changed with us, and also somewhat with new people that we brought, but it's a longer process. And we hope that by the end of our 5 years term, this landscape would look really differently. Guards are still outsourced, and all art handling is outsourced. So let's not go into details. These are all really things that would need to be changed. I just want to say one thing which is good is that because we are fully funded by the city, and because we don't depend on renting out the space to generate income or making blockbuster shows to attract tourists to generate income, we are so far financially very stable. So what we could do now when Corona started, we really could at least really honor our obligations to all those outsourced workers and even find a way to bridge some periods. We didn't send people to Kurzarbeit. So in that sense, once you are within the confines of institutional protection, which is built on a history that needs to be taken into account, and it's absolutely unfair, but as it stays now, yes, so it's not completely black and white, but it's,
yeah, and it's definitely a long and a slow process. We are also realizing that, both in terms of what are you navigated as kind of, like administrational on one hand, kind of, context, and also, of course, the history of institution itself, where in a way you can't just come and undo many things that maybe you would like to undo, but it's really a process.
At least not fast. I just want to add on this, how our collective practice changed with the relocation to Vienna. I think the basic thing was for us to accept that we were usually coming from outside and in some way underdogs. You could always criticize the institution because institution is guilty. Institution is having entrenched institutional modes of operation that are completely not, or over the time they deteriorate, and they are completely not in tune with the nature of artistic practice. This we all know. You are supposed to come up with the sketches months in advance so that the institution can do its slow work of making it possible. And this is what we need to accept now and find a way. We are no longer on this other side. Now we are the institution, and it's a challenging, actually really interesting process. And the other thing is how we as a collective are now part of the bigger collectivity, and how the fact that we are collective is not some kind of, oh, now they are so slow because they need to talk among themselves. How this is a virtue. How do we transfer some of our collective practices to the broader institution? And it works in small steps. And we also make mistake, and then we retrace, try something else. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I have many questions. I don't know where I should start, but one thing I actually wanted to kind of make a connection to is you mentioned sort of the rising nationalisms. I mean, this is not only in former Yugoslavia and other countries here, also in Austria and in Germany. No, let's not talk about the US, but what I was just thinking about was, of course, particular to Austria and also Germany, is our panel yesterday, the first panel, one of the topics was that of migrant labor in the sectors of, let's say, essential workers. And so on the one hand, you have these nationalisms, and yet on the other hand, you have, let's say, the hidden ghost geographies of labor that is doing most of the work in, you know, Western Europe, coming from countries in the former East. And I'm just curious if you have anything to say about that, or how you could, how you see the relation today.
I can start with the anecdote about the relationship Vienna-Balkans, where basically it's hard to translate, but like, you know, the anecdote says that everyone from the Balkans is working in the stables of Vienna. This is one from the times of the empire. And, you know, Kunsthochschule is in a space which used to be a stable. So now, you know, also like someone from the Balkans is running a stable. So let's hope that we can also take in the historical experience and try to build a little bit different structures. But yeah, it's absolutely, you know, something which in Vienna is so tangible for us. I mean, it's tangible just on the question of language, you know, which is really, really clear that as soon as you are in some kind of like low paid service jobs, it's absolutely a huge amount of people who are coming from our parts. I think that something that is a challenge for us as an institution, and that we hope that we can open up these spaces, is also that we in a way try to at least change the access, you know, to institutional structures. This was what I already mentioned. How do we make, you know, this kind of staple, well-funded institutional structure shared under different rules, you know, and also very much taking into account that for people who are, you know, then kind of part of projects in all possible, you know, positions and ways, that we insist that they have to be, you know, like treated fairly, and that also we were really surprised that, you know, just like these basic things, even, you know, like Kunsthalle was paying artist fees only now and then, and not always, you know, so just like making this as one of the rules, which is, you know, absolutely there. And it's also very much, I think, a question also of like the language. So I think the question of access very much into terms of, you know, kind of like who produces the program and how and so on. But it's also a question whom the institution is for. And this is something that we feel as a huge challenge, you know, that sometimes, you know, we also just say, hey, come on, it's us, it's someone from ours now there, come and see us. And, you know, every taxi driver answers, I have no time. So it's also a question, can we develop, you know, formats, ways of dissemination, projects, reaching out? It's a very long process, but it's very much on our mind. And I don't have a more concrete answer, because in a way, this was also something that we hoped to start, investigate more after we opened the first exhibition on the 8th of March. And then we were in a way, you know, kind of very much cut off. And something that we also feel is very important is that we don't just come and now from this position of institutional power kind of invent ways. I think Vienna is also really rich in very serious and committed organization, activists, you know, more people working with really, I would say, many years of looking for ways, how do we work together? And something we wanted, you know, like in the first months, we did a lot of collaborations, which we are thankful for and which were great, but we were on high level, you know, Kunsthalle and I don't know, Biennale, Wiener Festwochen, Burgtheater, and so on. But for us, the true challenge is also how do we move Kunsthalle exclusively from this position of still kind of, you know, high key representational city institution, and look for ways how we can also work with institutions and with people who have committed a lot of, you know, time and effort and knowledge into trying to open up different processes to different communities.
It's also really interesting to observe all of this, what Sabina was talking about and what is implied in your question. You mentioned migrations, and I mean, what's going on Bosnian Croatian border, which is just around the corner here, is just absolutely shocking. I mean, it's no longer shocking, but it's a responsibility that we should all share. But what is interesting for us in terms of institution, and this public institution, relatively well-funded, definitely stable for now, etc., is really to look at the limits of Viennese or generally social democracy, and I mean welfare chauvinism that it generates. And this is a question that is also very interesting for us, on which we don't want to make necessarily judgments, but it's something that we want to observe and that we are observing, and maybe we'll work around this. But it's a historical debate, of course, that is worth raising now and then, the limits of social, and I mean betrayal of social democracy, and different forms of welfare chauvinism that goes hand in hand with the right-wing rhetorics in many places in Europe, in Austria included. You have very progressive economic politics combined with absolutely anti-immigrant racist stance. Yeah.
And it's also known what is the Austrian position for the European solidarity discussions, no?
Oh.
Which is really, I think, one of the also really horrible processes that we are following now.
We have a question in our chat. We all know that one of the most challenging things working within institutional frames is facing bureaucratic processes that many times break necessary changes. As an artistic collective, is this modus operandi of bureaucracy put in question in the Kunsthalle Wien through artistic processes?
But that's what we are trying to do with the simple things. Like, we really want artists to be included in all the output that Kunsthalle generates. So they are working with us on marketing. I mean, so-called marketing. We don't want to do marketing. We just want to work with artists to develop message that goes out, and it happens through so-called marketing department. We are also trying to find, to kind of expand collectivity within the institution in different constellation, in different time frames, with different temporalities. So we do think, I mean, obstacles are immense. I mean, bureaucracy is epic, really. Time frame is unbelievably slow. So every kind of cliche one could have of a late empire bureaucracy, we are with amusement observing it here. But we think actually, I mean, collective ways of working and involvement of artists does challenge it. And our main, what we would like really Kunsthalle to become, and it sounds so simple, but it's actually really not written in the institutional DNA, it should be for artists there, and not the other way around, in which artists come to fill in the institutional processes. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we are repeating almost daily and trying to have as a kind of motto for every meeting or every decision that we make. And it also takes time. Yeah.
And I'm afraid, of course, you know, this is a question of this bureaucratization. I don't know whether there is any hope that everything that we are going through now, you know, like shakes any of that. But, you know, I always try to repeat this story, which again, Mladen Stilinovic was telling us how, in the 70s, he would have an exhibition organized with 3 letters. First letter invites him to come and tells him when the exhibition is. The second letter, he says, oh yes, great, I'm coming, I'm gonna bring the works. And third letter sends him a train ticket. So in these times, one also, I'm really thinking about it more and more, also it's interesting for me in which way somehow also this obsession with productivity, which then very often, in fact, falls behind exactly on discussing all of these administrational, bureaucratic procedure and so on, is something we felt the need to cling to. I mean, when we stopped, my life was not suddenly, I think it was for everyone, was not freed to think more and, discuss content more, but almost somehow we had an urge to reproduce, these endless meetings and Zooms and Skypes and this and that. Mm-hmm. So I'm really hoping also that I had feedback from a lot of colleagues that like exhaustion around it is also really huge. So I'm hoping that maybe, also some space opens up in all possible, how would I say, spaces of art production, that we try to think whether we can benefit in some way, in kind of refusing some of these procedures where, in a way, it's as a collective, yes, we also feel a lot of constraints, but I think on the other hand, it's really valid for everyone.
If no one else has any comments, I have one more thing that I wanted to address, because you mentioned that this idea of like, a collective going into an art institution or into the art world, how the art world, and we had this came up in a conversation about the Prize de Nationale Gallery yesterday. Mm-hmm. The fact that the art world is not really designed for collaboration or for collectivity. And as myself working as an artist in collaborations, the art world wants to have a singular name. They want to have one plane ticket, one artist fee, and this is it's in contradiction to the fact that you can't create the work that has been done, or the exhibition that's been put together wouldn't be the same exhibition created only by one person. And so, I'm just wondering how to change this, because budgets are thought for individuals.
Yes. I think really this corona situation should prompt us all to revisit all of the postulates also of how we operate in the art world. And this relying on individuality as a kind of ultimate expression of our human essence, this is not part of art. So we as curators in these practical terms, as a collective, not fitting necessarily in the art world system, but generally artistic practice is not as individualized as we are forced to see it. This is really important for us. This was always important for us to claim that, that art is happening as a collective practice, whether we acknowledge this, and let's acknowledge it, or not. And in terms of possible changes prompted by the crisis, which, as we are all aware, did not come out of the blue. All the elements of this crisis were there. The crisis just exposed it and made it concentrated, made it very visible. We should really think. We are trying to imagine things like how do we travel less, but of course not become local? How do people should stay longer? How do we restructure the whole ways of how budgets are made and what percentage goes really to the artist? And we know from our experience, it's basically 15% of the budgets are going really to artistic production and artistic, including travels and fees. And this is really, really little. And this, I'm not talking now about Kunsthalle. We didn't do this analysis for Kunsthalle. This is generally how it works. We did this analysis of budgets for Istanbul Biennale, where one could really see this. So how do we switch these budgets that they go more to the artistic production and that they can sustain really artistic subjectivities in their forms of labor and forms of life, and then making also the public face through the exhibition, not public face, public life through the exhibition. So these things would need to be restructured. We need to work more slowly, and we need to be really more generous. And this is, and when I say generous, I'm actually thinking of solidarity, but really in terms of sharing, not what's easy to share for us, but maybe also sharing what's hard to share for institution. How can you still find, how do we find those ways? This will be necessary. And collective practice was always there, and it will continue.
And maybe I just wanted to mention as a possible kind of, further reading for the listeners, that there is really the amazing project of Pirate Care, which I think is very precious in a way for something that we've been mentioning also about administrative and bureaucratic borders. And this is basically what they are asking, what Natasha already mentioned. So how do we care? How do we share? How do we work together and collectively in solidarity beyond the limitations of the current system? They're called Pirate Care. And they have a website where they, I don't want to go too much into it, but I think it's one of the very important questions for every tomorrow and today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. Now ending even with a project that I put the link in, and it's also in your exhibition in Kunsthochschule. It was a pleasure to talk with you, really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And I hope to see you in autumn, Nora, and wish you a good continuation of the discussions. Yeah. Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Angela.
Yes, hi.
We are now already at our next program point, and everyone joins. Fantastic. So what we thought is that at some point after 1.5 days of our symposium, we think together about what happened. What did we hear? What did we see? What did we learn? Just to understand better what's going on. So what happened actually is the question that we ask ourselves.
Maybe we can even ask some of our silent participants if they also have anything to say after 1.5 days. Maybe I'll just start if no one else has anything to say. Just watching the film right now, one of the quotes from Denise that she was saying towards the end really stuck with me, and so I had to write it down. And it was something that where she's talking about fossils, and she says something that has happened has not gone away. The products of slave labor have not gone away. And I just thought that this was a very interesting way to think about time and history and what we're doing, and the fact that how we are with each other is going away, and how our history is our future in a weird way. Anyways, I just wanted to chime in because I thought that was a really nice way of understanding and thinking about history at this point of time. Yes, that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, it relates to me. It related a lot. This movie, it related to this first discussion yesterday about labor struggles. I saw moments of connection, also of course different, but many moments of connection. And what I feel, what was interesting for me and what I liked at this first panel was how obvious it became that anti-racist struggles have to be labor struggles at the same time. That if we look at our situations, it is the structural racism of the labor itself that we in somehow discussed in this first discussion. And I thought, and it came in my mind when we talked about the award, and the discussion came up about this weird new capitalization on diversity that even became more after Black Lives Matter now in the US, or if we think about the MoMA collection and so on. So on the one hand, we have a representation of the diversity, and on the other hand, we have racist labor conditions, as much concerning the food we eat as concerning the institutions we go to see exhibitions in. So for me, what became important in our gathering here with the question of what system actually is to think labor struggles and anti-racist struggles together, which would also mean to come to structure and to somehow not leave representation behind, but link it with structure.
At the same time, how do the institutions engage with this kind of struggles? Because, for example, I work nowadays in a communication department of a museum. And when it came all those questions regarding Black Lives Matters and if we should put the black frame or not. And then if you go researching a bit more, the black movements also asked institutions not to do it in order not to empty the discussion, because this whole algorithms and how do you say, hashtags also make the discussion confusion. So please do not do it. Do it for those who represent the questions themselves. So I think it's also a question about how institutions do engage with the struggles and the aesthetic of the struggles also. I think one point that raised my attention actually from the starting, not only for us as organizers and also from yesterday and today, is a point that was raised by Grégoire in the Performance Commons, this relationship between culture, system and collectivity. This idea that if you want to do something that's not ready, you have so much work because that's not ready. So you have to start it from the beginning, just as Grégoire and his team did with the Station of Commons platform in order to give us the option of not only offering Zoom or us working in these transnational schedules and without a frame from the beginning, from the start. And also by cooking, for example, when we cook and we cook from the start, we don't use this things that already are ready. It's so much work. So, and it's always easier going outside the system that demands a lot of effort if it's doing collectively. So I think that to put in question that towards any kind of alternative collectivity makes things much more easy, just as Grégoire brought yesterday. And I think it's also what, for example, the girls from the award brought, or even the collective now from what, how and for whom. So I think it's a common point from the whole discussion.
Who is next?
You.
You? The one asking the question is always next. That's the way. In order to reflect a bit, I think that something that came in many different talks at many different levels is the idea of competition. And I think it was something Angela stated, that the competition is built into the structure or system of art from the very beginning. Of course, it's not only in art field. Like as soon as you graduate from school, you're going to compete with your previous colleague. Like, and then it's the market, and then you get the job or you don't get the job. And if I get it, he doesn't get it. It's a kind of sad situation. It's it's like in the movies. It's nothing personal, it's business, but of course it's personal at the end. But beyond this sad situation, like what is competition actually producing? Competition is actually dividing people. Like it is like separation process, and it's exactly what the system wants and need to sustain, so that it can enforce like this hegemonic control. And then this fits perfectly the neoliberal agenda. I mean, we see it in Finland. We hear more and more in art academy. Artist as entrepreneur. So what is the position? Like clearly it's like one against the other. is it really what we want? This is not what Station of Common wants. In any case, maybe a kind of answer would be to think those separation. I mean, to fight this separation would be to unite. But what does it mean to unite in nowadays? Even the pandemic is showing, like, how can we unite? We cannot even go to the street anymore. But maybe that if we cannot go to the street, and maybe it is like going to the street model is a bit
only that people go on the street now every day, have been in
yes,
Hong
but
Kong,
what I'm trying to say is
so.
But what I'm trying to say is that maybe another model of union would be better, in the sense that maybe a more horizontal way of unite. And I think that it relates to what Natasha, the previous speaker said, that sharing resource and maybe a way to unite would be to sharing resources. But what do we then define as resource? What kind of new resources we can think? And this is something that I've seen in the different talks, because people were using resource in different fields. This was good. Like one used knowledge as resource, someone else referred to care as resource, another one relation as resource. Maybe Station of Common is a bit technology as a resource. So all those things we can share, and maybe this is more this horizontal way of uniting. Or is it English to say that? But you understand what I mean anyway. I think this would be more efficient in the sense that it would, I think that it would produce more autonomy at the same time. And in that sense, I think the symposium did great, both in the sense like people were exchanging, sharing knowledge in the talk and in the discussions, but as well in the digital space, as Lorena said, thank you, that we expanded. It's not Zoom only, there is some alternatives. There are different ways to share things in the different spaces. And this is something that we all, like participants and organizers, can be quite satisfied about, and great job.
Yeah.
This is maybe what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in here.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, to yesterday to Stations of Commons, because this talk made me also think a lot about the affective dimension. So how can we, can we act within technology and collective and individual emotions? How can we do that? And it came to my mind that when we reappropriate technology and when we think about this from a psychoanalytical way, like it was also yesterday in the talk, maybe we can transfer a thought by Züleyha Rolnik. I just read her book about how to escape the capitalist colonial system. And she says, I quote, "We must reimagine the world in every gesture, in every word, and every relationship with the human or non-human other, in every way of existence, every time life requires it." So this is again linked to what Lorena just said, with this doing this lot of work of always rethinking and reimagining what we just got to to think. Yeah.
I think it involves imagination and taking risk as well.
Yeah, that's true.
But also it's a challenge about how not to empty these words, no? Because I think we've been hearing a lot about unlearning and decolonizing, and I face it myself because it's so originally, at least, it was the title of my PhD research, and now I'm facing a lot of trouble about using these words as well, because something that came also in, I guess it was also in the session about peering, I don't remember anymore, but about how to bring this, no, it was in the Award session, about how to bring these expressions like unlearn into concrete layers, to create structures, departing from this very system that we are within, to create a new one or to create an alternative. I don't know, but it's something that I feel that the collective, what Howard Fromm brought a bit about how do you work in this system to create a new system, but that's something also very concrete. It's a concrete labor, it's an everyday labor. It's not just the words, it's not just abstract. Of course, words are important in order to position a political frame, but at the same time, if they are just words, they lose themselves in time and space.
When you said emptying words or empty words, democracy was a word like this to me, because I've heard people talking about democracy, telling this or that was democratic for years, and I was often wondering what do they mean by this exactly. It's for me the same as the system question, or was like this. And in this particular case, to me, the comment by Oliver Marchart was very important, because he helps or helped me, and hopefully somebody else, to understand that democracy does not equal democracy, and that democracy is not one, but it has a lot of content, and there are different, things related to that notion of democracy, and you can fight for one or the other, and you don't have to accept that one part or one aspect of democracy is bigger than the other one. And to me, this is very helpful. And I think the most important thing about democracy is equality. And this is something that system lacks a lot. You can see that when you, when you see as a symptom of that system, even the possibility that there are terms like relevant and non-relevant. You have relevant work or culture or life or art, and on the other side, irrelevant life or work or art or culture, then this is somehow a synonym to inequality. And it's also referring to our topic of competition again. That's the very starting point. It's all about competition, relevant or not. And then next, if you are doing relevant work, it does not mean that your life is valuable. That's the problem that we were looking at in the very first panel. So one of the results for me is that I'm even more outraged than before after listening to all of the panels. And at least I'm an artist, and I started to think how to work with all these information as an artist, how to position myself, and that's what I'm doing now in the next years and decades.
I thought it was really interesting now in the discussion with WHW how important they felt the relation to artists is. I thought it is interesting. Maybe I felt as if the relation to artists became more important even in their practice. And it feels to me as if there would be, true or not, I share it with WHW, a certain belief in this subject position. Maybe because it has a role in society that can be also dangerous. Because if neoliberalism would be able to kind of organize everyone and everything as it already does in its own way, then we would all break out in anger because it would be so terrible and boring and just not, life would just not be livable. So capitalism creates a subject position that has the right to have other affects, to be more resistant, which is the sociological position of the artist. But problematically, these artists, of course, also they, on the one hand, they are also embedded in market logics and competition, as we learned in this award thing. But then on the other hand, obviously, there might, the enemy is part of the system, which is good, you know, which is also a possibility. Maybe it's a dialectical argument, but there must be a reason why one believes in artists so much nowadays.
That makes me think of one thing that I thought about yesterday that I wanted to bring up in the first panel that yet I didn't touch upon, was the fact that, you know, I actually have a problem with this very divide between, like, for example, we talk about the workers over there and the artists over here. And I mean, there's no reason for this divide. I mean, it's not a contradiction. I mean, these workers are artists. I mean, now this is maybe opening up a whole nother like conversation, but I don't think that an artist is some sort of exclusive position. I think it's a subjectivity perhaps that can be embodied by practically every human being on earth. I don't think that it's a particular, I mean, in capitalism, it becomes maybe a way to earn money and sustain yourself at some point. But I think, I'm not sure how productive it is to say some people are only artists and some people are not artists. And this is now opening up a whole new sort of...
I totally agree with you. Yesterday, I liked this. That's why I came even up with it again, this idea of artistic practice as political imagination. I mean, I guess we share this ability of political imagination. Maybe we have to silence it for so many reasons in our lives, but we have it, this ability of political imagination.
I have it too. But I don't know how to continue. I just wanted to say I'm with you.
And this is another thing why I like this symposium so much, and all of you, because there is nothing is cynical. Nothing is bureaucratic and nothing is cynical since I entered the context of this symposium. And actually my life is full of bureaucracy and cynicism. So it feels like a big luxury to be here and to discuss and to hear all these positions. And yeah.
Yeah, if I can say something about the political imagination and about what someone from the eco collective say about this, I think that something that really came often in these 2 days of symposium was this idea of political imagination restitution through history, through, like you say also before, through history and through ghosts in somehow like resources. So also this ghost or this history that we totally forget because of capitalism can come back like resources and can come back also like resources to be all together maybe. So this was something that also I found that came back many times in this conversation. I find really interesting.
Thank you. It's nice to hear from somebody, one of our symposium participants. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Oh, we have a comment in the comments. I like the idea that artists, workers, intellectuals are all artists, or le contraire. But facing the question of class, I would say that there is a difference, not because you make it, but because of the social division of neoliberal distinction. So I think that this question of sharing is really interesting and wonderful. What are the points / places where we can share?
Maybe you have an answer. Where are the points, places where we can share?
Can you repeat? I was distracted by the...
what are the points, places where we can share? A question by Jan Hendrik Gebbe in our chat.
Ah. So what actually the question is, what does it mean? What does it imply? What is produced in the sharing process? I think this is more interesting. Or this is how I understand at least. I think that I will refer a bit to the process of Station of Commons because it's something I know, but it happened because of the material condition we had. I mean that we to some extent we can share what we have, so it means that the points to share is to I would like to put it in simple words, but I cannot find. But so I will make it longer. The point in sharing is that it's like sharing. I will make it short actually. The point in sharing, or at least how I understand, is not to think sharing as a pie. So that if I have a pie, I give you a bit, and then I have less, and then you have more. I think the sharing is more the idea in information sharing. If I tell information to someone, then this person will have the information, but it doesn't mean that I know less. It's just everybody knows more. So this is what should happen in this sharing moment, so that everybody learn something, but learn not only in terms of knowledge, but in terms of what this point means.
And I cannot stop to be angry every day about the fact how knowledge has become a commodity, and all the games of making it a place of scarcity. You know, I really don't get it. It's exactly this. Academia nowadays plays the game of knowledge would not become more by sharing it, but the game of competition, as if I have to keep my knowledge with me. So this is another reason why a symposium like this is beautiful, if you think of it as such a sharing of knowledge in order to make it more.
I can't agree with you more. It's completely counterproductive. This like keeping privatization. This is, I know, nobody else knows, so that's why it's so special. It's really counterproductive to, I mean, it's really good for neoliberal capitalism, but it's really bad for collective action. And yes, like Gregor, like you said, it's not making yourself poor if you share it.
But this I can even elaborate in the field that I know the best, is the technological field, like the open source and non-open source. Basically, people build their software, then they distribute it, open it, people can use it, just use it, or people can use it and implement something else. Maybe this something else will be useful or useless, or will be found out some years later and then develop, and then it increases. That's the idea. But then in commercial software, then it's enclosed and it cannot develop, and then it becomes a product, which is another state of mind.
I mean, we see this right now in terms of the pandemic. I mean, not to change the subject, but I mean, the fact that, you know, suddenly companies are vying for the patent for a vaccine for this is completely contrary to public health. And it's really it's a sick way of thinking, and I don't see it going in a very positive direction.
No, it's not a philanthropic move, and totally cynical one. No.
But in a way, I also think that we have to avoid this trend about blaming people about not sharing, because the problem is that the whole system is framed for this competition, for you being relevant or not. And therefore, there's this whole idea about non-prosperity, that if you share, you have less. So I think it also was very interesting when the collective, how and for whom, brought this idea about how the Kunsthalle Wien brought in the open call the possibility of the artist direction being also a collective. So you have to change the structures. You don't have to blame the individuals. And I think that's also a very important thing about. That's it, the system is how it is, but you can change the system, you can change the people if you don't change the system, but you also change the system by changing people, and it's everything together at the same time.
I think it's great, but it also has its downsides, because only a collective of curators does not make an institution self-managed, of course. In the contrary, classically, if you would have more, I mean, it's complicated, because if you would say more curators and more artists, great, but how do you really rethink the structure, and who would lose by such a logic? So classically, I mean, I work in many collectives, and it happens that because we are 6, others are less. So the question is on a much broader level: how could one rethink an institution that is more based on self-organization? And only by an open call where you invite the collective to be directors, you cannot change it. In the contrary, you will have more directors. What would it mean for the rest of the institution?
Yes, I know what you mean, but I think it would be interesting if you develop a bit this notion about what can self-organization means. It means, for example, you have the freedom to do your own projects, but at the same time working for the collectivity. What you mean it could mean?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I think just classically of collective structures, you know, is kind of a distribution of tasks, and where no one is necessarily specialized, or that you have the freedom to move between, let's say, cleaning and then programming, which sounds totally radical. And I mean, and I'm sure people would laugh me out of the room, but you know, I mean, I think this is really necessary right now, especially with considering our first panel on agricultural labor, you know, that these, you know, people who are considered to be disposable. And I think this is also for institutions. I mean, you know, exactly, Nora, you were talking about the fact that the guards are, you know, subcontracted by subcontractors. I mean, this is part of the way that our economy is structured right now. And it would be, I think it would be silly to think that the economy doesn't structure our own subjectivities, the way we think about the world. And so therefore, maybe we need to practice, I don't know, what did Felix Guattari call it? Institutional psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. What was it? No, I'm not remembering, but a real restructuring, you know, which is, we could do it at Kunsthochschule Kassel. Too bad we're not all there in this physical space, but could be a small, easy place to experiment with.
You know that Laurence Russell tries it in Brussels in an institution, École de Recherche Graphique, ERG, in Brussels. She really also works with these concepts and tries to rethink an art school as such a context. So maybe we could invite her and learn from her.
Yeah, I just came across a question on my mind. Because we were talking a lot about labor conditions, but now I also thought about people who are unemployed, because there you also have got the question of relevance. And I think that how our system is constructed implies that people themselves feel irrelevant when they are unemployed, or people make them feel like. And that has got a lot to do with the notion of labor, and that is something you possess, that you own. And when you are unemployed, you don't own that. And so to me, it's very important to change the notion of labor, what labor is, that it is not so much connected to that system. And I'm wondering how art can participate in that, because I think art and artists have got experience with other forms and other notions of what work is or labor.
Maybe I would like to say a couple of things. I would react to what Lorena said about not blaming people. Okay, maybe not blaming people, but there is this idea of responsibility, and this is something the power doesn't want. Power wants to keep power, but never be responsible of anything. So I don't know if the idea is to blame or not to blame, but I think this is something that maybe the system should be more responsible for what it's doing and being answer, and should answer for what it's doing, which is always trying to escape. This was one point. The other point was what would be practices of self-organized collectives. I think the way I think that is not by thinking reverse, like let's go for a self-organized collective. I think the idea would be more to depart from what is to be done to achieve autonomy. And in that sense, the collective somehow built itself. And maybe this is as well definition of self-organized. I mean, this is how I see it. Another thing is maybe to David, I mean, it's just one sentence, but it's one that I like, is that I don't know exactly how to translate from my language, but I think you will understand. It's always, you can always lose one work, but you will never lose your craft and know-how. This is something important. It's not because you lose a position that you lose what you can do and what you're good at. And it's two different things. Nowadays, it's considered the same. You lose, I mean, one loses his work, is not able to do anything, but that's not true. It's not because you don't have the position to work that you lose the knowledge that is behind. That's what I wanted to say.
David, are you reacting or should I?
It's fine. I was just only thinking that, yeah, of course you're right. I feel the same, or I see it the same way as you do, Grégoire, but I think the system is telling you something else.
Don't buy.
Ah, yeah, great.
No,
Okay, yeah.
it's interesting because this how they say Ausspruch, these words that you said about work, Grégoire, we have it in Portuguese as well. Just translating is the work don't betray its owner. So if you work in something, it's yours. It doesn't mean that it belongs to
Cannot
someone
lose
else.
it. Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm.
And
Beautiful.
I also thought about something that it's connected to this peer-to-peer technology, because working in collectives in self-organization, I think that goes through a very basic and emotional skill is about trust. It just works if you trust and it's very individual. For example, we built here, so one peer-to-peer. You don't trust, of course you trust in the collective, but you build these connections peer-to-peer. And that's something that's very connected to the technology that you brought to yesterday. And I think it's also interesting that it's a matter of time. There's nothing you can do against it. You just trust someone. Of course, you can have some empathy and a good vibe, but it's something that you build with time. You can't rush the process. And I think it's the same about technology, because of course you have some codes and programs that already, we have templates, but if you want to do something unique and something singular, you need time.
That's what I found interesting in this peer-to-peer way of thinking and doing. And maybe to...
Yeah, no, Grégoire, you want? Because
I just want to complete something very quick. In this idea of trust, and that trust that operates over longer period of time, I think it's related to what I said previously, the responsibility. You trust someone because this someone takes the responsibility to achieve something.
Yes, but unfortunately, here I want to come in, because I think things are not so easy. Trust is a political affect as well. And distrust, racism comes with distrust. So it might be that someone is not your peer. And I would love to relate also to people that I don't consider my peer. Because if I only relate to my peers, in somehow I also reproduce already existing relations in society. And my question would be how to transgress also this already existing ability to become friends. Because friendship is highly highly organized habitually, as we know from Pierre Bourdieu. And I guess also trust. So I have a bit of a problem with this as well. And so this is one thing I would like to think about. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I would like to think about is generosity. Because of course, I think Lorena was completely right. It might be that now we talk about sharing and so on and fantastic, but this might be easier for some than for others. And I would love to think about a structure in which it is possible for some to share and for others not, without making it so, or for a special reason also, because I think if you are forced to share something that you don't want to share, what actually you feel is resentment. And I think it won't be helpful to build the society we believe in.
But I didn't mean, I don't know, I didn't mean as peers, and I didn't mean as friendship. I meant in a very broad way. I'll just give an example. For example, when here in Brazil, we have this Afro-Brazilian religions, and we organize kind of weekly parties, not parties, but rituals. And each one has a role. And there is someone that comes early to clean the dishes, that's someone that arrives just to celebrate, and there's this one that just comes for the ritual, and that's fine, because the positions are not equal, and that's really fine, because all of them is part of a collectivity. Even besides, even if we do not have the same roles. So it's fine. I don't mean something equal, and I don't believe in equality, actually. I think people are different and they play different roles, and that's fine. If you just have to have time to understand these different functions of the system and trust that, okay, he can give me this, I'll be happy with this because he has a whole. That's not friendship. That's just, you trust that this something he's gonna give you, doesn't matter what.
I mean, I hear what you say in the sense that, like, of course, not everyone is the same, and people have different skills, abilities, but the sense that people should not be equal, then I have to say, maybe I find it a bit problematic. I mean, I think, Nora, this is a huge question. I mean, this is a question of all this, but the sense that, you know, I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the big questions of our time, because if you find yourself on the, let's say, negative part of the equation of equality, you would not say that you don't want to have equality or you know, justice, should we say. So I think that this is a big challenge, actually, is how to organize ourselves where we can share and not feel resentment. It's a big question. This is the question, I think, of our time. I also think that austerity and the idea that there's not enough for everybody. I call it the austerity of the mind, has been quite implanted from neoliberal capitalism in our way of thinking. And it's quite destructive. And as we see now with these like massive differences in wealth, that I don't know how many, like 30 men own the wealth of like 80% of the world. It's a bit schizophrenic. So yeah, I think it's really important, especially in the field of art, to somehow to really talk about these things. I think it's important to talk about because a lot of times they're not actually addressed in these conversations.
So welcome back, everyone, from our break, and welcome to our next panel, Whose Exhibitions, Whose Worlds? with Nora Sternfeld and Lorena Vicini. Welcome, Nora and Lorena again. I'm very, very happy to hear you today, and I'm curious about your thoughts on the history of exhibition and how they construct worlds about the canon as a system of knowledge and the exclusions about alternative histories and other perspectives. I'm Julia Stolber and I will moderate this panel. I'm sure lots of you already know both of you, Nora and Lorena, but for those who don't know you yet, I will shortly introduce you. Nora, you will be the first speaker in this panel. You are an art educator and curator since January 2018. You are the documenter professor of the Kunsthochschule Kassel. From 2012 to 2018, you were professor for curating and mediating art at the Aalto University in Helsinki. Furthermore, you are co-director of the ECM Master Program in Exhibition Theory and Practice at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and part of the core team of Schnittpunkt, Ausstellungstheorie und Praxis, a co-founder and part of TRAFOCA, Office for Art, Education and Critical Knowledge Production in Vienna, and since 2011, a member of Free Thought, a platform for research, education and production in London. In this capacity, you were also one of the artistic directors of Bergen Assembly in 2016. Nora publishes text on contemporary art, exhibition, politics of history, educational theory, and anti-racism. And Lorena Vicini, the second speaker, you come from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and you're currently based in Belo Horizonte. At the moment, you're communication manager at Instituto Inhotim in Brazil and a PhD candidate at the Kunsthochschule Kassel. From 2016 to 2018, you coordinated the project Episodes of the South at Goethe Institute in Sao Paulo. Lorena Vicini is co-author of Inspirador, International Guidelines for Sustainable Cultural Management at Goethe Institute. The both of you will give us a 5-minute input each, and then both of you will again react on another. If questions are coming up from the audience, you're very welcome to put them in our chat and also in the Etherpad as you wish on sessions of comments, and we will have time to discuss them after the talk. Yeah, and now I'm really curious to hear you talking about perspectives on exhibition history during the 1960s and 70s and how it constructed worlds that might have been neglected in the West. Nora, in your lecture course this semester, you discussed a counter-canon and beyond of exhibition histories. How do you see the relation between exhibition histories and the canon, and what is the role of the documenter in all of this?
Thank you, Julia, for this introduction and for this question. Yeah, it's really interesting when I became this documenter professor in Kassel, and then I felt the duty to teach exhibition history and to understand what actually the role of documenter in all this is. And after 3 years, this year, actually you and me, Julia, we worked together on this lecture course, which is a series of podcasts looking at the history of exhibitions in the 20th century. And the more I learned about this history, the more I understood what I already mentioned talking with WHW, that after the Second World War, exhibitions have been a very important context of transnational gatherings and of reinventing worlds all over the place, and for different reasons. In different ways. And with this, I mean that not only the West constructed itself by the means of exhibitions, and maybe, of course, the MoMA might be a place where this happened, but Documenta as well. Also, in other places in the world, worlds have been constructed through exhibitions. And the episodes of the South to talk with the project that Lorena has coordinated and brought into life happened in exhibition history since I would say like in big transnational exhibitions, for sure since the end of the Second World War. And of course in Brazil, we encountered the beginning of this with the Sao Paulo Biennial, and we will talk about it, and with this construction of modern art from the South, because modern art has not only been invented after the Second World War as abstract art in the US for the West, it also has been invented and reinvented in Brazil in the 1950s. But not only in Brazil, as I already mentioned, exhibitions played a very important role in the construction of the non-aligned movement, or what, for example, in Cuba was affirmatively called by itself Third World. So not only the West constructed itself as a world, also the Third World constructed the world through the means of exhibitions. And very important context for that was actually Yugoslavia in Belgrade. You could see some things in Ljubljana, and then also in Sarajevo, but also Cuba, as I mentioned a bit later with the Biennale there. And for the Black world, you had very important festivals in the 60s and 70s. I guess this is what Julia was thinking about. If we think about Dakar, 66, Lagos, 77, these festivals of Black art and music. And within these festivals, amazing exhibitions. If we have time, we can have a look in a film, a movie that I love by William Greaves about this festival in Dakar 66, but I don't know if we will have time. If not, it's on YouTube anyways, and I will put the link in the chat. I really recommend it because it gives an impression of the embarrassing provincialism of Western art history, because honestly, I had no idea about all this before I forced myself to work on it as a documenta professor. So when we think back to a timeline of exhibitions from the 50s, 60s, 70s, we realize that something essential happened that did not become part of the Western, as I would say, provincial and limited canon. It was the time when the transnational protest movements around 1968 had their effect. So 68 had effects all over the world. This is also something that we used to imagine only in the West. Also had effects in Germany. And here, as a documenta professor, of course, I can tell you about the most well-known documenta that is very much part also of the construction of the subject position of the curator, Documenta 5, that was created by Harald Seemann, who was actually not called a curator at that time, but general secretary of Documenta, but was invented as a figure of a curator, as a new form of subjectivation. Unfortunately, however, this curator, Harald Seemann, was not in a position at that time in 1968 to understand and appropriately appreciate numerous important artistic forms of expression and awakenings that did not take place in the West. So if we look at Documenta 5, it still remains a very Western exhibition. I learned from Simon Sheikh something that one could find in the archive, and he found it in the archive that was quite shocking for me. I learned from Simon Sheikh that Harald Seemann got a letter from an artist, and this artist recommended him important positions from Brazil in the 60s. Important positions such as Helio Oiticica and Lydia Clark. And who knows a bit about Documenta 5 and the approach of the artists that were shown there, and who knows a bit about Helio Oiticica and Lydia Clark will immediately understand why these two artists have been recommended to Harald Seemann. Now, Seemann, instead of reacting interested or bringing this art or finding ways to bring this position in somehow to Kassel? No. What did he do? He wrote back to the artist in a letter in which he said, I have never seen the letter, this is what Simon Sheikh says, but I totally believe it, in which Simon said that Brazil was not ready for Documenta. Brazil not ready for Documenta. So, I mean, what's going on here? Harald Seemann, this Swiss guy, sits somewhere as general secretary of Documenta, gets some names, and is in the complete position, totally able to answer for a world art exhibition that Brazil is not ready for it. I think this to make ourselves this clear, to understand the role of Documenta, also to in the sense of deciding what art is ready and what is not ready for Kassel, needs a further discussion, needs us to understand that it's not enough to just put things in the canon. We have to question how the canon has been organized, what was its political role, and how it can be how it can be debated nowadays, and how can we relate to it also with all these histories and ghosts of denying, silencing histories, putting them under the carpet, marginalizing them, and so on. So this is what I would say, and now I'm really interested in what you think about all that, Lorena.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Julia. It's such a pleasure being here with you again and again, and I hope for a long time. So, as you probably know, because we've been discussing this here, my research is about the colonization of institutions, of artistic institutions. And the decolonization discourse also is about understanding that the world, as seen as the only world, the world is just our world. It's about this possibility of the coexistence of a multiplicity of worlds. That's something that the colonial enterprise was and still is very effective in the attempt to bury. In this whole notion about knowledge epistemicide, and the term epistemicide was coined by the sociologist Boaventura de Souza Santos to describe the systematic eradication of the third world knowledges by Western sciences. So when I talk about epistemicide, I do not only mean that several indigenous languages are dying because the indigenous are dying, but also a whole way to be, to understand, and to relate to the world. And then if you think about that, the relation between the epistemicide and the history of exhibition, what's this relation? So from my understanding, the immediate consequences are two. First, they give an idea of centrality and periphery that turns every movement less complex and therefore more boring. Because if we do believe and do practice those kinds of labels, meaning central and marginal or peripheral, or even canon and counter-canon, that does mean that we believe in this kind of system that creates opposite things, binary categories. When we all know that this idea of centrality is a fiction. We have been talking yesterday and also today is a very present topic about how do we turn theory into practice. And so here's the $1 million question. How do we internalize the decolonial turn into ourselves? How to turn beautiful words as unlearn into action? And perhaps it's a question of knowing that at the same time is believing and doubting. To know that the world operates in a binary logic, but at the same time do not believe that's the only logic possible. And I think that's here is when we win against the colonial enterprise. But coming back to exhibitions, histories, of course, the colonial perspective should be committed to a feminist and an anti-racist struggle. But that's just the first step. I think that bringing the colonial perspective into the exhibition history is looking at the material with fresh eyes, taking into account how this material can unfold in the present. is to look at art pieces, pictures, documents, videos, believing and doubting at the same time. To acknowledge that they are part of a history, but that this history is still alive, is still being rewritten every moment. So taking what Nora just brought, I'll bring as a short example the first São Paulo biennial, which I had the chance to research a bit, thanks to a project that is on hold or still on the move, called Complication Divisions, which I had the chance to work with Nora. So I don't know if you all know, if you are all aware about it, but São Paulo biennial was the second biennial of the world. It was created in 1950, before Documenta, that the first Documenta is from 1955. When you look at the documents, and I think everybody should have the chance to learn Portuguese, just to have the chance of doing it, because the São Paulo Biennial archive is so amazing. You notice that the São Paulo Biennial founder, that was called Cicillo Matarazzo, was an Italian descendant. And Brazil has a history of encouraging immigration of Europeans in a movement to whiten society, but that's the topic for another conversation. And so Cicillo has lived in Europe when he was a teenager. And as you can see in the documents in the archive, he had always had contact with the European art system. And when visiting the Venice Biennial in 1948, and that was the first edition after the Second World War, he decided that he wanted to organize a similar biennial in Brazil. So that's already a sign of how these divisions are complicated. And I don't know if there is any divisions. There are any divisions, because it's also proven in the documents that Cicillo also profited a lot from the Second World War, because the art pieces were, the prices were lower, so he could afford to buy a lot of classical and canonical modern art and bring it to Brazil and create collections in Brazilian museums. So that's already a sign of this flow, this not division world in the way that we believed. And another point that raised my attention was that from its very first edition, and very differently from Documenta, São Paulo Biennial had already entitled itself as the first São Paulo Biennial. So it expressed, since the beginning, a clear self-image of continuity. It was just the first biennial since the beginning. In its first edition as well, São Paulo Biennial had the clear ambition. And at the same time, you can see in the documents a lot of letters that were exchanged between Cicillo and MoMA direction that shows how São Paulo Biennial was very driven by the American soft power politics in South America in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But it was very clear for the biennial how it was performing an important role in the international relations. So from its first edition, the São Paulo Biennial counted with 19 countries represented, among them Haiti, Canada, Japan, and already giving clues about how important articulator in South America as well, counted as well with Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Uruguay. So taking all this information into consideration, what makes a biennial a counter-canon? I don't know, perhaps it's just a matter of geography. And I leave here this question in there to be answered by everybody.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Lorena. I feel the need to answer immediately because I, of course, thought a lot about the question of should I just speak about alternative histories and do a lecture course that would just multiply the perspectives towards history, or would I actually choose from the position of the Documenta professor a way to believe that history with a big H has to be claimed, has to be challenged, has to be questioned, and I feel that it would not be enough to just add little stories and stories and stories and stories. Even though my lecture course is called Canon, Counter Canon and Beyond. And of course, this is also what I propose as a very important part of understanding history. History as histories, as a very important part of understanding the possibility to look back and to let the ghosts also of history work through a reflection of power relations that is not just silenced in itself by a new power relation. So yes, I think it makes sense to speak about counter canons, also because I think it is important to look at how canon is constructed and to look at it critically. But yes, I also completely agree with you. This is not the only way how we can and should look at history and histories. And I am so glad of your work and the work of all the other people that will present today, because this is actually what we all together do in our research contexts.
And I just remember, I did forget to mention it, but when I was looking into the archive, there was also a letter from Sheila Lerman, that she was a curator in the 80s in Brazil from the Sao Paulo Biennial. And she wrote to, what's the name of this curator? Schnecken Documenta curator, what's the name?
Burger.
And she wrote him, hey, we have a lot of catalogs and a lot of knowledges that we would like to share with you. That was in the 80s. And then Documenta didn't answer. And then she wrote again and say, hey, you didn't answer me and I still want to send you the catalogs. So I think it's also, I don't know, this this notion of centrality, because when we are moving our bodies, this notion of centrality is also, keep changing and exchanging and geolocating. So it's not something that's fixed in a point. It's something that's always mobile.
Yeah, but one last thing, I mean, it's very interesting because we discussed with some colleagues from Brazil as well. And if you look at the archive, there was the relation to Cuba was never big. I mean, the Havana Biennial was not a place where people from Sao Paulo would send a catalog. So it's also interesting that this letter itself shows about a certain relation to this centrality.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know, Julia, would you like to?
Are there any questions? I don't see questions yet in the Etherpad. If there's none, I would have a question to the both of you, maybe, because yeah, I think it's so interesting to look at these exhibitions and histories from these perspectives, and also discuss and rethink actual discourses and the canon or system of knowledge in the past and now in the present, but also in the future. We can clearly see these practices. For instance, when we think about Documenta, but not the one that Harald Seemann did, but for example, the next one, and what will exhibitions become with a collective like Ruan Cooper? And maybe if you want, you can share some thoughts about that.
I think it connects a lot with what we discussed previously about how living together and how working together. So we also had the chance to meet Farid from Ruan Grupa in our last meeting. And I don't know, what draws a point that I thought was very interesting, he doesn't seem to make any effort to be there. It's something that was also natural, these articulations and this collective work, and also respecting individuality and the limits of each one. So one member of the group was able to come to Kassel to be there with the family, and that's fine. It's not the same positions and the same needs for everyone. So how to respect different contexts and that doesn't mean that you're better or you're worse, something that's different. And I think that's the same here. Probably when you mentioned Ligia Clark and Hélio Oiticica, the questions that were raised in the 60s here in Brazil about precariousness, for example, it's something that nowadays is very up to date to the conditions in which we are organizing exhibitions. So I don't know, it's something about going back to the archive and finding new centralities according to the time we are living. And I think it makes a lot of sense.
Just add one sentence also because of time, but it also this topic of the resources. I feel that this is something that we will encounter again and again, and that is beautifully worked through in the practices of Group.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Nora and Lorena, for this talk and sharing your knowledge. As we saw, there's a question. Finally, okay, I will read this one from Gabriela. I think the ones that I think are peripheric preference to relate to the center, the prejudice from Zeman to Brazil happened in Brazil endogenously as well. As my experience of the ones that I think are in center is the repetition of the hypocrisy Nora told about earlier. Yeah, thank you, Gabriela, for this comment. And yeah, thank you.
Should I say, can I just quickly say something about it? If you look at all these big, huge projects that happened actually in the third world countries, very reflected, very interesting projects. Like if you look at this movie of Dakar, you will get a glimpse of it. Yeah? If you look at it, you see that this is not true. It happened that in this alliance of other countries, not only the West was a reference point. This was not the only reference point for many places in the world. Of course, it was clear that this West, in its own provincial way, takes itself as a reference point that is quite powerful, so you could not relate to it. But it was not the only relation. And I think this is also very important to see from today's perspective. We don't have to, of course, we have to take into account the power relations of what was called in the West Cold War and what was actually in Latin America, for example, hot war in many places. So we don't live in this time anymore. So we have to try to understand how these causes function, but they don't have to completely organize ourselves. And from this perspective of looking at history, I think the question of what system actually makes another kind of sense. Also because if we look at the fact that systems, like in German you say Systemkonkurrenz, the opposition, the competition between systems was what organized politically in the West so-called Cold War. After 1989, the West in somehow celebrated itself that it won and put neoliberalism in the global world. And this means that exhibitions even now in somehow have a propagandistic role for this neoliberalism. They had a propagandistic role from the Second World War until 1989. This did not stop after 1989. And in this sense, I think it's also very important within our field to ask the question of what system action.
Absolutely. I think this is a great last sentence for this talk. And I now will hand over.
Yeah, I guess Angela did a question here.
Oh, thank you.
Do you want to read it?
Yeah, I can read it as a last comment, and then we have to go on because we are already over time. But Angela asked, did you understand that you mentioned that Brazil and Cuba were not close in terms of the first exhibitions in both places due to politics?
So that's always a doubt, but according to the research I did in the São Paulo Biennial archive the relation. Brazil was under this soft power politics from the United States. So you find a lot of documents and letters exchange between MoMA's directors and Brazil. So I guess the São Paulo Biennial director. So I guess that would be why Cuba was not in the first biennials.
But it's in the 80s. I mean, it's very interesting. Exactly what you say is absolutely true, Lorena. I just add 2 small sentences. So we had a guest, Gabriel Ferreira Zacarias, an art historian, very interesting scholar and thinker from Brazil. He gave a lecture in Kassel, and we talked with him about that. And the Sao Paulo biennials of the 80s were not related to the Havana biennial at the same time. So it's really a question of where you look at a very specific time. And he said he did not find relations. And this is what we were just interested in finding out more. Of course, after 89, yes, Mosquera was very invited to Sao Paulo biennials. And Mosquera is like one of the founders of the Havana biennial. But before 89, this was not a clear connection for exactly the reason, I guess, that Lorena mentioned.
Yeah.
Thank you.